today's World Insight with Tian Wei. A new volley of tariffs between China and the U.S. Would trade tensions get worse before it gets better? And global changes seen through the lens of the Chinese military classic Sun Tzu's The Art of War. The book's French translator explains.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin our program today with the latest on trade tensions between China and the United States. On Thursday, a new round of tit-for-tat tariffs went into effect to the tune of a 25% duty on $16 billion worth of goods. Meanwhile, officials from both sides have resumed talks in Washington as the U.S. prepares fresh tariffs on a further $200 billion worth of Chinese goods. A 6-day public hearing on the new duty is underway in Washington, D.C. right now. What will it take to pull back from the worsening trade rift? Is there any hope left? Before we get down to the discussion, take a look at this.
The United States and China carried out a plan to levy 25% tariffs on another $16 billion worth of goods on August 23, as scheduled. The world's two largest economies have now slapped tariffs on a combined $50 billion worth of products since early July. The final tariff list from the U.S. targets 279 imported product lines, including China's semiconductors, electronics, plastics, chemicals, and railway equipment. China's final list targets 333 U.S. products from fuel and steel to autos and medical equipment. Though the trade friction would likely get worse, the two sides are at least resuming talks they abandoned months ago. Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce Wang Shouwan is in Washington for mid-level talks with American officials, led by a senior U.S. Treasury official, David Malpass. The two-day talks began on Wednesday. The Chinese Foreign Ministry has weighed in on the latest dispute and the new trade negotiation.
In order to protect China's own interests and defend multilateral trade mechanisms, we decided to take countermeasures against U.S. tariffs. For the ongoing trade negotiation, we hope the U.S. side can work with us and that good results can be achieved. The details of the talks cannot be revealed for now.
Meanwhile, Washington is also holding public hearings this week on another $200 billion worth of Chinese goods, which Mr. Trump threatened to levy before. They could take effect as early as next month and would effectively tax half of China's exports to the U.S. More than 300 business leaders are speaking out over 6 days of hearings to tell the government why more tariffs will be good or bad for business in both countries.
So, would the battle over tariffs indeed get worse before it gets better? Let's ask our panelists joining us from both China and the United States. With us in Beijing, Zhang Jianping, Director General of the Center for Regional Cooperation with the Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation. In Hong Kong, we have Hong Hao, who's the Managing Director and Head of Research of Balcom International. In Washington, D.C., the U.S., we invited Jacob Kirkgaard, who is a Senior Fellow of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, also co-editor of the Transatlantic Economic Challenges in an Era of Growing Multipolarity. Welcome to the three of you, gentlemen. I want to begin by asking you, Mr. Kirkgaard, since you're in Washington, you probably get a better feeling about what's going on right now, about the negotiation between China and the United States than most of us. So, is there any hope?
In short, no. I don't think we should expect anything out of these meetings. They are essentially, if you like, placeholder meetings. But as you've already said several times, I think this relationship, unfortunately, has to get worse before it gets better. And therefore, I also believe that it is overwhelmingly likely that the announced $200 billion worth of U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods later next month will come into effect, And in my opinion, the only way this gets resolved is through the personal intervention of President Trump and President Xi.
Right. Okay, Mr. Hong, in Hong Kong, we understand this round of negotiation in Washington, D.C., led by Chinese Vice Minister of Commerce, Mr. Wang Shouwen, and the other side, his counterpart in the U.S. from the Treasury, actually is a preparatory meeting. And the two sides understand very well. In November, very likely, the two presidents, President Xi Jinping from China, President Donald Trump from the United States, likely to meet with one another in the multilateral platforms such as G20, APEC, and some of the other occasions. However, from now to then, still a long way to go. Is there any hope? Same question to you, Mr. Hong.
Yeah, well, I think the minister is out there in the U.S. To lay the groundwork for the November meeting. And I think it's highly anticipated at this stage. And, with some reconciliatory comments from Mr. Trump, there seems to be some hope. Not all hope has been lost. And also, today's imposition of tariff has already been planned a long time ago. So the day was set, and also the amount of the tariff was set as well. So today, really, there's no surprise, and that is one of the reasons why the market here in Hong Kong and also in Shanghai are relatively calm today.
No surprise at all, Mr. Zhang. There seems to be quite a lot of pressure, though, on the international market about what is the future as a result of this quote-unquote trade war between China and the United States. Mr. Zhang, at this point, China, of course, is looking not only at the negotiation, but also the economy back at home, whether it's stock or the exchange rate or the real estate market or people's confidence in the market. Mr. Zhang, how should we understand all these factors evolving with the big backdrop of the U.S. trade war against China?
Yes, actually, we already said that trade war will, make both sides suffering from that process. Especially, the confidence in market will seriously be impacted. This kind of things actually not only showed in China's, economy, but also showed in the U.S. For example, a few, factories or plants, bankruptcy due to, costs climbing up. But I'd like to say that we have to explore, possible rational, solution between China and the U.S. Because
what are they?
Yeah, irrational, policy will make us get into big trouble.
Okay, Mr. Zhang, since you talk about rational, let's talk about rationality. What are some of the specific points that you think this preparatory meeting goes on between China and the United States now in Washington could actually work on without knowing at this point yet? Maybe our guest, Mr. Kirkgard, could help us later about the bottom line from Washington, D.C. But Mr. Zhang, let me go to you first. What are some of the areas that both sides could work on to prepare?
Yeah, I think that actually no matter how difficult, even if in the U.S.
So what area?
Yeah, I think that for international trade and international investment, market access issues, IPR issues, all of those things actually we need to put on stable, and we have to negotiate one by one. But please do not hope that we can solve those problems within one night, because many of them actually formulated in the past decades. So even if for bilateral free trade agreements, it will take time.
Right.
Also, this time I think that for the problems between two sides, also we will take time.
Well, Mr. Kirkgard, on the one hand, everybody knows it takes time. This is not easy issues to be resolved. It's not like one side has a list and the other side can do it overnight, or vice versa. But on the other hand, time is very important, because as a result of prolonged trade war, whether in a big portion or a smaller portion, both sides are going to lose as a result to a certain extent. So, Mr. Kirkgard, at this point, what are some of the areas that both sides can work on? Is there some concrete so-called bottom line the U.S. has in mind, from your understanding, of course?
Unfortunately not. I think one of the problems of this entire deterioration of the U.S.-China relationship is that it is not clear what the United States actually wants from this trade war, if we choose to call it that. There are no obvious goals or policy targets to be reached. They talk about vague leveling of the playing field, better IPR protection in the Chinese market and things like that, but concretely the administration has offered very little. And that unfortunately leads many of us here in Washington to draw the conclusion that this is in fact not driven by economic fundamentals or anything other than short-term politics. So that what the Trump administration is doing is that it is deliberately picking a trade fight with China in the coming months in the run-up to the midterm elections, and then possibly sometime immediately after the midterms election, through a bilateral summit between the two presidents, come to some sort of solution. But it is, in my opinion, futile to look for economic or even legal rationale behind this. You're going to have to look at the short-term political calculus of President Trump to find the reasons for why the U.S. is conducting the policy that it is.
It's very unlikely one could read the mind of Mr. Trump or his logic. However, Mr. Hong, Mr. Kirkegaard's opinion about the short-term political gain by the current White House has been actually a talking point for many analysts. However, some have been also suggesting in the long term, the inevitable so-called conflict between China and the United States as a result of incumbent power and rising power. Whether we believe that or not, we have to see. But Mr. Hong, during this process, it is already very difficult for both economies. Mr. Hong, what do you think are China's bottom lines when we are looking at the future of trade and economic relations with the United States? As economists, how do you see this?
Yeah, well, I think it's always better to work on different opinions, towards different issues on the friendly ground. I think the way that Donald Trump seems to be taking is a little disappointing, to be honest, and also because now he seems to be in quite a bit of legal trouble, and there is a potential for him being impeached by the Congress. So we can't rule out a possibility that Mr. Trump could use trade war as sort of a diversion of attention from his legal troubles. So there are many things that we need to watch out for in this negotiation, but I'm hearing that the U.S. businesses are really against it now, because the U.S. exports to China and the tariffs being imposed on those exports are actually final products. For example, U.S. automobiles, U.S. pork exports, and those are directly hit on the U.S. businesses. So I would say that every party has a lot to lose in this trade war dispute or trade disputes. But I would say, I would say that it's imposing quite a bit of costs for both economies.
Right, we already have 50B. That is the number coming from both sides, putting tariffs on each other's exports to the other country. And now we're talking about $200 billion, which is a proposal coming from the United States, the current White House. Mr. Trump plans on enacting another round of tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese goods in September. Of course, we all understand September is also an important political month for the United States leading up to the midterm election. Unlike previous tariffs, the products targeted this time would include a vast array of consumer products like food, plastic, rubber, electronics, chemicals, engines, and more. It would cover half of all goods coming from China to the United States. As Mr. Kirkgard earlier articulated, many of these goods are actually produced by American companies here in China, with the global supply chain providing components of all of these goods before it came out of the factory to different parts of the world, including the United States. So, Mr. Kirkgard, let me go to you about that. Now we know the hearing is going on in Washington. Industries are speaking out. Many of them are against the Trump proposal of another $200 billion. But the question is whether opinions coming from them are going to be relevant in any way to the current White House, as we have seen the style of working in the Trump administration. If not, are we going to just see a circus and then everything goes back to the worst scenarios?
I think, unfortunately, the voices from U.S. businesses on the U.S.-China trade relations are unlikely to be heard in this current White House. I think the reality is actually that
let me ask you a little bit further, Mr. Kirkgard, if I could. Yes, if I could, on two things. One is whether this voice is big and loud enough, whether the business communities are really making their points. You know, making points is one thing, but really making the point is another thing. Secondly, what are some of the important players from now on you are looking at in having any impact about the Trump administration's trade policy toward China, and probably some of the other major players as well? Mr. Kirkgard, may I invite your wisdom on these?
Yeah, well, I mean, the short answer is that U.S. businesses have increasingly spoken up against the Trump trade policies, but they have done so not only against China, but also against the Trump administration's renegotiation of NAFTA and the potential for automotive tariffs, not just with China, but with the rest of the world. And so far, in fact, it looks like they will be more successful in forcing at least a postponement of any breakdown of the NAFTA negotiations or the other global auto tariffs, whereas it is in my belief that they will be less successful when it comes to blunting the impact of a further escalation of the trade frictions with China. And from the perspective of U.S. business, what can they do? Well, in my opinion, the only thing they can really do is they can support pro-trade candidates from either the Republicans or the Democrats in the midterm elections. But the problem they will face is that protectionism is actually, especially against China, is unfortunately one of those areas that has support both in the Republican and the Democratic Party. So precisely what U.S. businesses are going to do in the coming couple of months in the run-up to the midterm elections is a very open question. But as I said, unfortunately, I do not believe they will be successful in containing further escalation in frictions with China.
Right. There's action and reaction, of course, coming from China, United States. About the China's reaction, Mr. Zhang, I have to tap into your expertise about trade. China has been planning to go to the WTO once again on the further tariffs the U.S. is likely to put, is already putting on Thursday, in fact, on the $16 billion of Chinese goods. Earlier already went to WTO China about the $34 billion. So if $200 billion coming from the United States, you bet China would do the same thing. But the question is, Mr. Zhang, can WTO help? Is WTO as relevant as it used to be, particularly for the coming next year? The appellate judges in the WTO are going to be below the necessary number, and therefore it does not have anymore the power to go into this process of legal judgment. So may I have your thought, Mr. Zhang, about China's chance of going to the WTO?
Yeah. As a member of WTO, also China will respect WTO's role for international trade dispute. In this regard, China has to sue U.S. to WTO. of course, as you mentioned, that given that the trade dispute mechanism has been destroyed by the U.S. side and cannot play a role in the near future. So we cannot, hope that in short term the problems will get solution. However, I think that we hope U.S. side could be responsible, member of WTO, and also, that even if the U.S. has a different opinion on WTO, but we have to respect WTO as a global trade order, has to play a role. This is one thing.
I see.
Another thing is that between China and other WTO members, we also need to work together in order to support WTO multilateral trade regime.
And Mr. Kirkegaard, before I go to the Chinese guest for further comment, let me come back to you once again about WTO. Overall, how do you see the Trump administration, if they are having a victory in the midterm election, going to deal with the WTO issue? Will they, almost in the similar logic as what you earlier analyzed about NAFTA and about the other issues related to global and regional trade, or will they be categorized in a totally different way?
Well, I mean, I think first of all, we should be clear that if the Democratic Party wins the midterm elections and controls at least one of the houses of Congress, in light of the most recent developments here in the United States, there's no doubt that the majority of the American political system will be consumed with the issue of impeachment, yes or no. This, unfortunately, however, means that President Trump may be even more bent on pursuing aggressive trade policies vis-a-vis China, vis-a-vis the WTO, and vis-a-vis everybody else around the world, simply to distract attention from his own legal problems, as has already been discussed. So, unfortunately, I think we are entering into a period of even greater political uncertainty here in the United States with respect to the future of the Trump administration, and particularly its international economic relations, and of course, as part of that, the bilateral U.S.-China relations. But there is no doubt that the outcome of the midterm elections will be crucial.
Mr. Hong, as China and Chinese economies like you could not in any way sway the midterm election in the United States, but the question is very relevant to China and many other economies. That is, what to do with globalization and what to do with WTO, which has been a platform China ardently subscribed to and also believe in.
Yeah, well, China's entry to WTO, has been a great success, especially for the Chinese people. I think now we're having a trade dispute with the U.S. and we're going through the formal motion with the WTO. But the problem with the WTO when it comes to this kind of problem is that it has too much paperwork, so it takes time to sort of go through all the motions. So I think for the time being, because September is drawing close very quickly. So for the $200 billion additional tariff. I think China has to work with the U.S. to resolve it. I think for now, what I'm hearing is that in Washington, the hearing for the $200 billion additional tariff wasn't going very well because the security line was too long and people can't get in to the hearing. So there are many things that is happening down the road, and I would say that given that the additional tariff is not going to resolve the U.S. concerns about, for example, the IPR protections and all that with China. So it's probably not going to help the U.S. even if it imposed $200 billion tariff.
As all of you have said, there are a lot of fluid things going on the ground. A lot of factors could change where things are going. All we can do is to observe closely and certainly have all of you to come back to our program again and discuss them. Thank you so much. Jacob Kirkegaard coming from Washington, D.C., Mr. Zhang Jianping here in Beijing, and Mr. Hong Hao in Hong Kong. Really appreciate it. And you're watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Still to come on our program, I speak to the French translator of the Chinese classic Sun Tzu's The Art of War, Valerie Nige. But can Nige really explain how the 2,500-year-old book, The Art of War, can still be used to interpret current events? Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight. I'm Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. In this modern world, there are far fewer wars than any other time in history. We hope it will keep it that way. That doesn't mean, though, military science is less important than before. Military theorists around the world like to draw inspiration from classics by ancient philosophers, and Sun Tzu's The Art of War from China is essential to their reading list. Earlier in Beijing, I spoke to Valerie Nige, a French translator of the Chinese military classics. Before the interview, take a look at this.
The Chinese dynasties from 771 to 476 BC has a poetic name, spring and autumn. But the reality was far from the tranquility its name suggested. Wars between different regions never ceased. In this chaotic society came a legendary figure, China's most outstanding military strategist, Sun Tzu. His book, The Art of War, is a widely influential work that has affected both Western and Eastern philosophy. The text is composed of 13 chapters, each of which is devoted to one aspect of warfare. Commonly thought of as a definitive work on military strategy, the book even has an impact on business tactics, legal strategy, and beyond. It was first translated into French in 1772 by the Jesuit Jean-Joseph Marie Amiot, and the first annotated English translation was completed and published by Lionel Giles in 1910. For the past centuries, the book has been an important reference material for global strategic research. Valerie Nige, head of the Asia Department at French Foundation of Strategic Research, retranslated The Art of War, together with the Military Treaty by Sun Bin, another work of the Chinese military classics. For her, these books offer the wisdom that could well guide modern defense policies in Asia and beyond.
The whole translation of The Art of War from Sun Tzu from ancient China. What do you, as a military strategist and as the translator of this beautiful work, impress the most about any of those strategies?
First, as a translator, the language. I love Wenyan, and Sun Tzu's, everybody says Sun Tzu is very difficult, but when you get used to it, the Wenyan is so clear and pure as a written language that I was really impressed. Two parts are very interesting. One is the last chapter, because it's very exciting, is about spies, how different kind of spies you can use. But I think what impressed me more is the fact that very early he says that you do not have to pay attention only to military capabilities, but also to the economics, politics, alliances. So it's a very broad, wide vision of strategy on war.
That's exactly what I want to ask you, Dr. Nige. What exactly is The Art of War about? Is it about war, or is it about peace?
Well, it is about war. You cannot deny that it is about war. There are a lot of chapters in Sun Tzu about how to win wars in a very practical manner, and he describes all the different terrains of the war. But this is also about peace, and one of the most important sayings in Sun Tzu is that you must win wars without making war, you know. And it has been very important for China in Chinese history, how to try to convince a potential adversary that his interest is in accepting some conditions maybe, so it makes you win war without really making war. But Sun Tzu is also written in very broad general terms, so you can also use what he says for your personal life. He says that you have to make plans, to evaluate many factors before making a decision.
Among it, the strategies, one of the most well-known is know thyself, know thy enemy. You will always win no matter what. That's one of the most popular saying. How much does it say about planning strategy?
It is one of the major conditions to win war, or not only war, but to be successful in any activities is to know the conditions of the enemy and conditions of the situation. So this is one of the major lessons from Sun Tzu, that you have to know yourself, of course, your limitation, it's very important, and to know the enemy, and that enemy is to be taken in a very broad sense. I mean, it's not only the enemy in today's terms, it's just in relations with others, whatever the other is.
And you've been doing research about East Asia security for a long time. If I ask you, which part of the strategy should decision makers in East Asia look at when it comes to Sun Tzu, the art of war, for today's world, today's region, what would you say?
I think the most important lesson from Sun Tzu is to remember that for Sun Tzu, as for everybody else, war is extremely costly. It has a cost, a huge human cost, economic cost. And so one has to be extremely prudent and careful before engaging in policies that could lead to a possible war. Sun Tzu wrote that book in order to help the sovereign, as I said, to win war. But his main lesson, once again, was that war was extremely costly and was to be avoided as much as possible.
One of the things people are extremely interested in these days is what would happen when there is power shift in the world. And we know there is. The speed and the prospect is not known. So in that regard, Dr. Nige, what would you say among the art of war? Which part of the wisdom can we draw from in order to shine some light on the prospect?
Well, power shift is a reality. It doesn't have to, the result mustn't be war between powers. And I think the most important thing is to be able to manage relations between emerging power or more or less declining power. Once again, avoid misperception about a declining power that maybe is not so declining. So one has to be very careful and well informed. And one of the most important lessons maybe from Sun Tzu is to know that he put a lot of stress on the autonomy of the military. He thought that military people used to know the reality very well, what they can do, what they cannot do, and that the prince must not put pressure on the military to act against the interest of the nation.
But that's not the case anymore. It seems that the military has become part of the government, and the military will make its decision based on the decision coming from the central government, no matter which country we're talking about.
Yes, this is why the governments must be extremely careful in making their decision between deciding for actions that could lead to conflicts or war, because once again for Sun Tzu, and I think this is the most important lesson, is war is extremely, whatever the result, war is extremely costly.
And these days, it is mainly a debate between the civilian and the military side of the government about whether to proceed with the war or a small-scale conflict. Usually, the latter, which is the military, would debate for pro, while the civilian side would rather be more careful. So when you look at the ancient wisdoms coming from Sun Tzu, more than, take a look at it, more than 2,500 years ago, does it really help?
I think if you take it once again in general terms, it helps. It always helps to make plans, to think well before acting, to respect some division. You said that the military is part of the civilian power, and the civilian do, but the military are very well informed about the real situation sometimes, and sometimes the civilian people do not really know what is the real situation. So this is why they need to debate and be extremely careful in evaluating what can be done and what cannot be done.
What do you make of the United States' status and position in today's world as a military strategist?
A lot of countries are eager to have the United States on their side. So we don't know what the United States might or mightn't do, but I think it will be a huge miscalculation to extrapolate from what is going on in Europe by considering that United States will not be ready to act in East Asia. And these miscalculations happened before, and a war with the United States in East Asia would be, for everybody, extremely, once again, costly, many fields. And I think this is something that has to be avoided at all costs.
In Sun Tzu, The Art of War, there has been a specific quote: pretend inferiority and encourage his arrogance. That, of course, is a military strategy during warfare, meaning that just pretend to be low profile, inferior, so that the other side would feel much superior and even become arrogant. This is an interesting debate that we also have in China about its foreign policy. Should China remain low profile?
Well, I would say that when China was choosing to keep low profile, it has been extremely successful, and including extremely successful in gaining support from all countries in the region. I remember the time when all countries in Southeast Asia were very eager to develop relations with China, perceived always as an opportunity, and were not very eager to have the United States playing a role in East Asia. I don't want to interpret too much, but I must recognize that since a few years ago, the mood has changed. Countries in Southeast Asia, including countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, who are very close to China, are much more prudent and still want to have good relations with China, but are more eager than before to build relations with the United States. So I would say, this is my personal point of view, that the strategy of keeping a low profile might be more successful. And this is what Deng Xiaoping said. I mean, you bide your time, not only for biding your time, but just to have the time to build your own power. And so I think this is a very important lesson to remember.
But then on the other hand, what to make of the future? When we have a changing future, we need to lay out the plans and the thoughts to the others. How much is it about the level of strategic thinking, communication? How much is it about the level of real actions? That is also an interesting debate as we are facing a changing world.
Yes, I think that to go back to Sun Tzu, Sun Tzu said that you have to...
we're going back to Sun Tzu.
Yes, we are back to Sun Tzu. And I think he said that you have to make plans by looking carefully at all the factors and evaluating all the factors. I think this is what politicians, and not only military strategists, and economists too, have to do. I mean, just look at all the different factors, not rush to make decisions, be extremely prudent and careful, and I think this is the best way to plan for the future.
Since we're talking about Europe, which part of the art of war do you think, and the philosophy related to it, can really help Europe today? I mean, you have a lot of crisis going on.
It's very difficult for me to find a solution in Sun Tzu for Europe because we are in such a mess these days.
And also you're in the mountain. It's hard to look at the mountain when you're in the mountain.
Yes, exactly. So I don't know if I can find in Sun Tzu any lessons for Europe. What I know is that things have to change and to evolve because the situation in Europe is not very good these days on many fields, be it economics or relations inside the European Union. Yes.
For Sun Tzu, there's a specific quote: never to have military alliance, or at least very careful about it. That, of course, lead us to NATO. What would you make of its future? The Cold War has already ended.
The Cold War has ended by countries belonging to NATO do not see it as an obsolete organization. And as you know, France is back into NATO. Yes. Even France is back into NATO, and the former Eastern European countries are very eager to maintain NATO. As long as Europe will not have its own defense capabilities, as the European Union, I think that NATO will be believed or felt to be very necessary to a lot of European countries.
Is it going to be one weapon against Russia?
I don't think that to ostracize Russia is a good solution.
Dr. Nige, it's such a pleasure to have you. All the best. I'm looking forward to reading more Sun Tzu, The Art of War.
Thank you.
Really appreciate it. Merci beaucoup. Thank you. That's Dr. Valérie Nige, who is a translator in French, China's classic, The Art of War. That is all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, try to find us World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Sina Weibo. From me, Tian Wei, and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.